Copperhead Democrat, and General Jackson was his hero. Andrew Jackson's reputation as a strong but populist and egalitarian leader who attacked entrenched privilege would have presented a striking contrast to the province's political leaders, and perhaps served as a model for the young supporter of constitutional reform. Political conflict arose in the province as the government became dominated by a small group known as the Family Compact. They acted to preserve their own privilege and to recreate an elite British society by maintaining the power of the appointed executive branch in opposition to the elective assembly. By giving the Church of England its privileged position, and, according to the reformers, by promoting such projects as the Welland Canal and the Bank of Upper Canada at the expense of local improvements such as schools and roads. American egalitarian ideology became the basis for political opposition as a reform-conservative split emerged in the province. By the 1830s, the reformers were an identifiable group who demanded constitutional reform to extend political participation. According to a leading scholar, they tended to equate democracy and prosperity, and often contrasted the lack of popular participation in state affairs and the economic backwardness of Upper Canada with the popular sovereignty and prosperity of the United States. Reformers also drew on the example of British radicalism with its political unions and calls for constitutional reform. When the provincial governor disbanded the Assembly in 1836 and helped conservatives gain an overwhelming victory in new elections, many in the reform movement were radicalized, led by the fiery newspaper editor William Lyon Mackenzie, who began to agitate for a new political union with reformers in Lower Canada, present-day Quebec province. They began to organize meetings throughout the province. Economic hardships created by a poor harvest and the tightening of credit caused by a commercial depression throughout the Anglo-American world further exacerbated this volatile political environment. By the fall of 1837, armed meetings had taken place, and Mackenzie was moving increasingly toward rebellion, although his activities were largely confined to the provincial capital of Toronto. News of rebellion in Lower Canada led to an ill-planned insurrection by Mackenzie during the first week of December. Although Mackenzie's troops were easily dispatched by provincial forces, early news of the insurrection seemed to indicate success, and radicals in the western part of the province led by Charles Duncombe quickly gathered to join the rebellion after hearing rumors that he and other leaders would be arrested by local officials. By December 12th, news of Mackenzie's defeat finally reached the west, and Duncombe's revolt dissipated as he advised his followers to return to their homes while he and rebel leaders fled to the United States. Among the rebel leaders who joined Duncombe in flight across the border to Detroit was Samuel Edison, Jr. Not much is known about Samuel in the period immediately after the rebellion. He may have joined Duncombe in his attempts to organize an invasion from Detroit, and perhaps in a failed attack in late February 1838 on Fighting Island in the Detroit River. Among those who stayed behind was Samuel's brother Marcellus, who was imprisoned briefly before being released on bail on December 21. Although some of those most closely associated with the rebel leaders were treated harshly and a few executed, particularly after a series of failed invasions led by the exiled rebels, the authorities were generally lenient toward the majority of those arrested. In the London district, which included Bayham, no action was taken against most of the followers, including Marcellus Edison. Samuel, on the other hand, was indicted for high treason and his estate seized. Unable to return to Canada, Samuel spent some time in Detroit and Peru, Ohio, before settling between 1838 and 1839 in Milan, Ohio, where he was finally joined by his family. What attracted the Edison family and many others to Milan were the economic opportunities expected to follow the opening of the Milan Canal on July 4, 1839. The 3-mile canal between Milan and the navigable portion of the Huron River gave the dull inland village, population 600 to 700, an outlet on Lake Erie, and according to the local newspaper it soon became, after Cleveland, probably the first town in value of its exports between Buffalo and Detroit. During the 1840s, Milan was one of the leading grain-shipping ports in the world. It also became an important shipbuilding and regional manufacturing center with a population of over 1,500. Along with the growing city, during these years the Edison family prospered. Samuel, who apparently also speculated in land, supported the family as a shingle maker. His brother Thomas operated a ship that brought shingle bolts from Canada. Although they were not one of the town's leading families, the Edisons were well off and associated with some of Milan's more prominent citizens. In August 1841, Samuel obtained a plot of land on the bluff overlooking the canal basin on which he built the 7-room brick house in which Thomas Alva Edison was born on February 11, 1847. The last of Samuel and Nancy Edison's 7 children, he was the 4th to be born in Milan, but the only one of 4 who survived early childhood. The last died in 1847. His 3 siblings, 18-year-old Marion, 16-year-old William, known by his middle name Pitt, and 14-year-old Harriet Ann, called Tanny, had all been born in Vienna. In the year of Thomas's birth, Milan reached its peak as a grain port, shipping over 900,000 bushels of wheat and nearly 138,000 bushels of corn. However, grain shipments soon began a precipitous decline as farmers began to bring their products to Mansfield, which was on the newly opened rail line between Sandusky and Cleveland. Wheat shipments from Milan declined by over half in 1848 and fell to under 282,000 bushels in 1849. Milan's economic decline eventually affected the Edison family, who moved to Port Huron, Michigan in the spring of 1854. Little is known of Thomas Edison's life in Milan, but from all accounts it was unexceptional and included typical boyhood activities. There is some evidence that young Thomas actually called Alva, or Al, while growing up, was a sickly boy. One of his friends from Milan claimed that he had a catarrhal infection that bothered him at times. He also recalled that among Thomas's playmates was Mary Taylor, who lived nearby and would go to bed with him when he was not feeling well. Another playmate who was born the same year as Edison later wrote him of things we both remember of the old canal, where we went boating and swimming in summer, skating and playing shinny in winter, and of the hills we coasted down in winter, and of the ships they built in Milan. Edison's own recollections included a visit to Vienna to see his grandfather, the covered wagons of a Milan gold rush party that included his uncle Snow Edison, who died soon after his arrival in California in the fall of 1849, the marriage of his sister Marion to Homer Page on December 19, 1849, and the drowning death of his playmate George Lockwood. Other accounts tell of his fondness for building little plank roads out of the debris of the yards and mills, of his learning the songs of the lumber gangs and canal men, and of his copying store signs in the village square. Perhaps because of his illness, Thomas did not attend the local public school, although his older siblings did, but his mother no doubt taught him to read and write. As a former schoolteacher, she would have been well prepared to do so. There was at that time a general expectation in American society that mothers would teach their children to read before they began attending school. While Milan was Edison's birthplace and his home for the first 7 years of his life, the lumber town of Port Huron was where he grew up and received most of his early education. It is not known why the Edisons came to Port Huron, but the town had a sizable Canadian-born population, and Samuel was likely aware of its booming lumber industry. It was twice the size of Milan and had a population of 3,100. Edison later recalled that the town in its pristine youth was a great lumber center and hummed to the industry of numerous sawmills. An incredible quantity of lumber was made there yearly until the forests nearby vanished and the industry with them. The wealth of the community, invested largely in this business and in allied transportation companies, was accumulated rapidly and is freely spent during those days of prosperity in St. Clair County, bringing with it a high degree of domestic comfort. Although Samuel Edison's fortunes waxed and waned over the years, the family lived comfortably in a large 2-story house that had been built by the first purveyor to the Fort Gratiot military reservation in a pine grove on the north side of Port Huron. According to a later resident of the house, it had 6 bedrooms on the 2nd floor. At various times the Edisons had boarders in the house, and downstairs a wide hall ran from north to south through the house, on either side of which were 2 large, high-ceilinged rooms with wide fireplaces. From the house one could see Lake Huron and the St. Clair River, as well as the abundant woodlands. Sometime after moving into the house, Samuel took advantage of its location and built a 100-foot observation tower to the south and charged 25 cents for the view. This apparently became a paying